And now the second part of the story of Esther in Kabbalah and the women of the Bible. It's a long story. It's told in 10 chapters in the Hebrew Bible, and that is enough of a clue for us that, given that there's 10 sephirot on the Tree of Life, this is a story that pertains to Kabbalah. It's a story about rising up from your tribal roots, taking on your kingdom, who you're really meant to be, and then having the courage and determination and discipline to live that life. We have Esther, a Jewish peasant girl, who rises up to be the Queen of Persia. And we know, from the fact that the king hasn't sent for her for 30 days, that she hasn't done it. She hasn't managed to step up into this soul triad of her, the place of the soul here, the place of human destiny. She's not stood up and taken on her greatness. She's not put on the crown of who she really is. However, because the Jews are going to be massacred by order of the king and Haman, and Esther hasn't told the king that she's a Jew, she's now in a position where she has to come into the kingdom and go to her husband and fight for the life of her people. Now, Esther is known as the first mystical Jewish Messiah. In the mystical tradition, there is a Messiah in every generation, not just the one. There may be one great Messiah at the end of days, and the Jewish mystical tradition would fully honour Jesus of Nazareth as a great Messiah. But they would probably also include Buddha and many other people, including Moses, and possibly even people like Gandhi in that. These are great people who came to do a service, who came in fact to offer their life for their nation. In the case of Christ, his life was taken, and the story of the resurrection was the beginning of Christianity. In the case of Esther, she had to offer her life to the king. She had to go to the king, even though he was quite likely to kill her, in order to try and save her people. Now Esther has gone to the king, and she has said, I am here, and he has offered her the golden scepter of mercy. And he says to her, Queen Esther, what is it that you want? And he also says to her, you can have whatever you want. So we've got a very big clue here that the king loves her, but it was something that she'd done that had withdrawn from him. Because when you just suddenly show up out of the blue and your husband is delighted to see you, it probably means he's fond of you and he's sorry about whatever the quarrel was. I'm just speculating here, but it's likely. Anyway, Esther, having taken those 3 days out, this is the Sabbath principle, very important, has considered and received inspiration. And it's like the story of Elisha, the prophet, when 3 kings came to him about a drought because they were trying to trample across great tracts of land with 3 great armies, and they couldn't feed them or water them. And they said to Elisha, how do we get the drought? And instead of going, you do this, Elisha probably went, oh my, but what Elisha actually said was, bring me a musician. So they did. And while he was listening to the music, he received the inspiration, the word of God, as to what to do. So I think it's very safe to assume that in those 3 days, Esther has been inspired as to how she could act. And that's because she's come into her kingdom, into herself, into Tiferet, grown up, and is willing to take on the mantle of being queen. So she says to her husband, she doesn't go, please save my people, I'm a Jew, I'm a Jew, I'm a Jew, which would be absolutely catastrophic. She says to him, I simply want you and Haman to come to dinner in my apartments tonight. Now Haman, remember, is the hated enemy. Haman is the one who has plotted the destruction of the Jewish nation. So this represents the stepping up to embrace the shadow side. Because if you look at this as an internal story, we are Esther, we are the king, and we are Haman. And Haman is the part of us that wants to destroy the true us. So we actually have to embrace it and look at it and see where it's coming from. And so Esther invites Haman and the king to dinner in her apartment. And at the end of the evening, the king has obviously had such a good time that he says to her, Queen Esther, what can I do for you? Even up to half my kingdom is yours. Wow! So you would really think that she'd say, right then, could you save the Jewish nation, Lord? But she doesn't. She doesn't. She has this incredible patience, and she says, she knows it's not time. She just knows. At the level of the soul, you have knowledge, access to knowledge, wisdom, and inspiration. Knowledge here at Da'at wisdom or understanding here at Binah and inspiration at Chokhmah, and direct contact down from the source itself. So Esther says, just that we could do this again tomorrow. Such a simple request. And this allows time for the situation to be resolved. So what happens is, now we have to read between the lines here, but the king wants to spend the night with Esther, and Haman persuades him not to, tells him that there's something really important to be done. So the king goes away with Haman. He's a weak man, remember this king. He's a very powerful warrior, but not terribly good at ruling a kingdom. And he obviously can't sleep that night because maybe his pride is such that he can't send for his wife that late. And he's sort of thinking he wished that he'd stayed behind. So he can't sleep. So he asks the scribe to go and get one of the scrolls from the reading room to read to him, to help him get drowsy. He said, get a very old scroll, one covered in cobwebs, from the back of the cupboard. And the scribe does go and get a very, very, very scruffy scroll hidden right at the back of the cupboard and starts reading it to the king. And it's the account of how Mordecai revealed to the king the story of the people who were going to assassinate him. And the king goes, you wicked scribe, I told you to get an old scroll, not a new one. This is only a few weeks old. And the scribe says, but it was at the back of the cupboard and really dusty. And the king goes, hello, I smell a rat. And he looks at the scroll and he realises that it is dusty. So he goes and has a look to see exactly what honours and rewards were given to Mordecai the Jew. And he sees that there was nothing. Nothing was done. And he realises that this is Haman, and that something is going on. So his suspicions are aroused. And he says to Haman the next day, in the morning, if I wanted to heap honour on somebody who'd done me a huge service, an absolutely massive service, what would you suggest? And Haman is extremely arrogant and thinks that the king's talking about him. After all, he was invited to supper in the queen's apartments last night and everything's going stunningly. So Haman says, well, I put the kingly crown on him and parade him round the town on my horse, because that would show the honour that I feel for him. And the king says, fine, please organise for that to be done for Mordecai the Jew. You can almost feel sorry for Haman, who has to organise this for this guy he's having condemned to death with the rest of the Jewish nation. So Mordecai goes round the town on the horse, and the king is realising that all is not as it seems. That night he has supper with his wife and with Haman again, and Haman's a bit sheepish but trying to play up. And at the end of it, the king says to Esther, and you can tell that he loves her, he says, Queen Esther, you can have anything if we can just do this again tomorrow. What is your wish of me? And Esther just looks at the king, who loves her and whom she loves, and says, give me my life and that of my people. And then the king has to decide. But see the value of the patience, the strength, the commitment and the discipline of Gevurah in waiting, and the loving kindness in loving the king. Because the king has been a weak man who has agreed to destroy her and her people, but she has offered unconditional love. She has become a queen. So the king goes out going, oh my goodness, what am I going to do, what am I going to do? At which point Haman realises he could be in big trouble here and throws himself on Esther begging mercy. The king sees him throw himself on the queen, thinks he's attacking her, has him pulled off and sent away and executed. And then the king calls in Mordecai, and together with Esther they work out a way of sorting out the massacre. There's a little bit more to the story about that, because unfortunately the massacre can't be stopped, but the Jews are allowed to defend themselves and all ends well. So this is a really, really important story, not only for the feminine, but for all of us, in the idea of standing up for who we are, becoming the individual, and then opening up to the wisdom of spirit that comes down and tells us what to do. It's not about fighting and protesting, it's about becoming ourselves and opening up to source. The festival of Purim, the Jewish festival, celebrates the story of Mordecai, Esther and Haman every year, and absolutely perfectly that it should be a great festival. It's a festival of the soul, of the stepping up to you, because Kabbalistic tradition says that every one of us must perfect. Every one of us one day will become Messiah. In that we have no free will. We can take as long as we like about it, but like Esther, one day we must step up and wait to receive the benediction.